Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to cover how you can do German style tank camo without having to use an airbrush. If you're anything like me, you probably spend any hobby budget on more miniatures, which means an airbrush tends to stay out of your price range. But it doesn't mean that you can't do these cool old styles. This is a little bit impressionist. I'm not sure that this is 100% accurate to anything which would ever have actually been in the field, but it does the job. And as far as our gaming sort of pieces go, I think this works perfectly well for a vehicle that's going to hopefully knock out some Shermans as it comes across them. Now I've chosen the Panzer IV because this of course is a classic, as close to ever was the main battle tank of the German army during the Second World War. And it's pretty cool. The shirts in particular make it look a little more imposing, so I've decided to print myself out one like that. You'll see, hey. And yeah, I'm really pleased with the result. I'm quite happy to go ahead and play some games with this. So I'm going to list the names of all the paints in the description below. This one does go through 3 or 4 different manufacturers, so you can quite easily find alternatives for most of these. But a little bit of Googling won't hurt if you want to find alternatives for things like the mud effects and such. But let's get into it, see what you're going to need. So to start off with, here is our Panzer IV. As I mentioned, this is a 3D print, so the hull and the turret are just 2 pieces. You'll see I've not bothered priming the underside there, because as always we're going to play the game of who will see it. Now this will make it a little difficult to get into some of the areas between the Schützen and the hull, but again, we're painting a gaming miniature here, it won't particularly matter. If you do happen to have a plastic kit, you'll probably be able to leave the Schützen off, paint those separately, and then glue them in place onto the railings here. But just so that you can see, this is what we're working with. Now I've started off by giving this a primer of Desert Yellow from Army Painter. You could, there is a very similar color called Desert Yellow from Vallejo, which works quite similarly to this. Doesn't come as a primer though, so you would need to prime it. I'd probably start from white, then give it a couple of coats of Desert Yellow. Army Painter Spray does the job perfectly well, and it's a great color, so that's what we're going to start with. Now there's 2 bits of hardware here that I need to introduce you to. You'll notice I am wearing a glove. And I normally don't bother, but the reason being because I'm going to be picking this tank up a lot, and the Schützen are going to sort of stop me from gripping it from the tracks like I normally would, I'm going to wear a glove just to keep the paint job safe, stop any thumbprints from showing up on there. We've also got one of the bits of foam from inside a blister pack, and you're going to end up with a ton of these, particularly if you are playing bolt action or something similar, anything with metal miniatures, you'll end up with a fair few bits of this. And this stuff, oh, we love it. So you've got ordinary square of this from any old blister. First things first, let's make our brush. So I've got here a pair of scissors, terribly complex, to snip that straight in half. We've got those 2 brushes. You'll see 2 paints lurking in the background there. This might be related. Now I've got over there, this is a little dollop of red leather. This is quite a bright sort of brown color, but you'll see why we're using it in a minute. We'll fold this over first once, twice, we'll try for a 3rd time. Yeah, that's about what we want. Okay, just a little dollopy brush there. Put that one aside. Now we'll take off the turret to make this a little easier to reach. What we're going to do is get our brush and just dip it into our little circle of paint. And you'll see I'm dabbing it to see sort of what I'm going to leave behind on the model. So I'm going to start. Let's go across in a line. All right, so I'll start here, and we'll just start dabbing on this red leather. And you'll see it's quite patchy going on first. It's obviously not really designed for this kind of treatment, but don't worry. All you need to do is go over it a couple of times. Like if you do one pass and you think it looks fine, that's all well and good. You don't need to touch it up. But I think particularly towards the center of some of these areas, you want the color to be a little stronger. So if you need to, just go back and fill it in. So what I'm going to do is one wiggly line across the center, second one across the back, and then a third at the front. So we want to break up the shape of this tank. Now you will find in some cases that just because of the shape of the tank, what you're trying to do with this big wad of foam is going to be a little difficult to get into some of these areas. So you see these gaps here. Obviously I've got just a raggedy old brush. Honestly, the more ragged and old the better. And just stipple on into some of those areas and finish that off. Particularly if you are doing this with the shirts and on, you'll find this is a good way to get into some of the deeper areas too, just so that they don't stand out. But easy as that, just fill in those gaps. Now that we've done all of the red on our tank, I'll give you two guesses. We had a second brush after all. I've got a Russian uniform, and we're going to do exactly the same thing. Now it is up to you. You can follow the pattern quite closely and sort of mirror the first set of lines that you did, or you can do little patches of green close to it. I recommend have a look at historical images or anything like that, which will give you some ideas of what might have looked cool. These little patchy green areas, they look quite effective. I am going to do a thin green line that follows quite closely the red patches though. And you'll see here, the reason why I've done the red first is that the green tends to cover it much better than the other way around. So because this is my second color, obviously I want to save time. The easier it goes on, the better. So let's come back and we'll have a look what I've got once we've got the second line of green on. Now the tank is ready, but it's a little flat, right? So I've got here some soft tone, and all I'm going to do is get one of my big cheap brushes and just apply this all over the vehicle. It doesn't matter if you get some streaking, but try and paint your lines all in the same direction so that if you do end up getting any streaks, they'll at least look natural, So I'm going to go over the whole vehicle, being fairly generous with this, and give it about 20 minutes to dry. Oops, that green wasn't dry yet. Now you'll see once that's dried, we've got some nice shading in all of the recesses, but it does look a little dark, and we have got some tide marks in some areas. It's not a big problem. We are going to fix that up, and a lot of that's going to be with this stage. Now you might have seen my secret weapon here. I thoroughly recommend go grab yourself a pack of makeup brushes. This thing here, this is, what is this called? A 109 Luxe Face Paint. I have no idea. I ordered it off of Amazon. But it has turned out to be one of the most useful bits of kit when it comes to painting tanks. I've got just a little itty bitty dab of Vallejo Iraqi sand on this. I'm going to work that into the bristles, same as we would for any old dry brush. What you'll find is you get a very soft dry brush effect. So let's try across the top here. You see, it doesn't leave very much behind at all, but that's ideal because you can sort of go around, pass over an area 2 or 3 times and build up the color. So even on flat areas, you'll find that you can get a little bit of sort of faked out modulation by just passing over this 2 or 3 times to get a little bit more color into the surface. Obviously you will need to go back a couple of times and do this, but I'm going to go around now and dry brush, especially paying attention to the edges of any armor plates. Let's just do this whole tank with a little Iraqi sand and my makeup brush. Now after a couple of passes with the Iraqi sand, doesn't that look better? We've got some nice edge highlighting, we've blended together the colors a little bit as well, and we have gotten rid of the worst of the pooling, although there are 1 or 2 spots which I should have been a little bit more careful when I was applying. But for putting on the table, this will look perfectly acceptable. Especially if you have some decals or something, now would be the time to apply them, because what we're going to do next for our weathering and tracks and all what have you, is going to make a mess of those. If you put your decals on last, it will look a little bit peculiar, that they are shiny and clean, when the rest of your tank is a fraught mess. So let's peel this to bits and get into the next stuff. Now I've trimmed myself up another one of these little sponge brushes, and I've got German Camo Black Brown, which is a mouthful, but this we're going to use for our chipping effects. So same as we did with the camouflage, but what you want to do is get towards any edges that you want a nice chipped armor effect, and just dab with a little bit of this color. You'll find it goes on pretty quickly, and because it's quite dark, it's going to stand out fairly well. I would suggest all along the bottom of the schürzen, just the way that these things would have, encountered grub and material off of the ground quite regularly. But otherwise, don't go too overboard with it. It is easy to very quickly lose control of just how much weathering you are applying. And I think, we say less is more. And quite commonly, it's not. More is more. That's what more means. But in the case of these armored vehicles, you put too much of this stuff on, you over-weather them. Instead of looking like they've seen battle, they're going to look like they've driven through hell and back, and not in a cool way. Really think about how much of this you want to apply, and don't go nuts with it. Think as well about areas that the crew are going to climb over. Strictly speaking, a pair of boots is not likely going to chip paint, but it'll leave behind little bits of dirt and accumulated gump that will work in the same color. So anywhere that crew are likely to be sort of climbing over, just dab a little bit of this stuff. Edges of hatches. Take a look at any real armored vehicles for inspiration if you need a bit of guidance. Now, we haven't gone completely bonkers with it, but there are a few chips and areas that are likely to see a lot of impacts, crew activity and the like, and I think that'll do us. We want to be fairly sparing with it, just enough so it looks like it's seen some action. Now, some of you will have noticed I haven't done anything whatsoever with the tracks yet, and there is a very good reason for this. Once we've done our weathering, they're going to all but disappear, so don't muck around and waste paint on them. So I've got here ragged old brush, and this is Typhus Corrosion. This is a Citadel paint. What we're going to do is just start absolutely bucketing this along the tracks. You will find some other companies do similar sort of stuff to this. Vallejo in particular, I know they do a mud and dirt effect. You may also choose to use, whichever dirt you like the look of, to be perfectly honest. Make sure you're sort of splattering some of this just randomly into areas that would see a bit of action underneath. What this is going to be is our weathering for the tracks. So be generous. Don't worry if it doesn't completely cover the running gear. Like if you end up with some yellow patches, that's all well and good. Obviously, this is more geared towards weathering that will look like road dirt or stuff that's been kicked up a little bit more Normandy than Eastern Front, but you'll never guess what I'm painting. Alright, so I've added plenty of that. My tank here, this is going to be rolling through hedgerow hell. Most of our games are going to be set in sort of the European theatre of operations, so I've added plenty of muck, and I think that's going to work pretty well. This Typhus Corrosion, this is going to serve as sort of the wet mud. What I've got now, we're going to do some slightly drier stuff, and I'm going to my makeup brushes again. You could use any old dry brush you like for this, but I've got some flat brown. This is another Vallejo colour. And what I'm going to do is just poke. Stipple's not really the right word in this case. I am poking. And just sort of flicking areas that I want slightly drier or maybe messier gunk. Alright, so those areas where we have put on our Typhus Corrosion, make sure that you're doing a couple of big splotches of this on there, but don't cover it over entirely. You want this to be random and to look a bit grubby. Then, when you start finding that you're running out of, flat brown on your brush, you can start just running it along, and you can actually overbrush some of these areas to get a slightly more damp, grubby look. Up to you how much of this you like. Again, I would suggest you probably don't want to go completely mad with it like I am, but that is your choice. Alright, now I've got another brush, and I've got some Vallejo Flat Earth. This we're going to cover over a little bit more of the vehicle, and we want to be a bit more careful about how we're applying it. this I'm going to lightly dry brush upwards. So this is going to sort of reflect dust, grime that's accumulated. You'll see it does sort of lift off some of the stuff underneath as well, which is quite handy. But we want this to be a little bit more, this is going to cover more of the vehicle. So don't be afraid, particularly on the shirtsons, to start going up a bit further. Same too, you're going to want to apply a little of this up around the front of the vehicle, because this is an accumulation of dust and grime. So be a little bit more generous with this. But as always, less on your brush, give it a shot, and then add more if you need to. You don't want to just overload your brush, put too much on in one go, because that will not look good. So once you're happy with that result, you can go on to the next color and our final set of dry brushes for this weathering. Are you ready for this? This is the big bopper. I would recommend a big soft brush here. So I've got another one of my mini makeup brushes. Like I said, go to Amazon or something, and I've got some dark sand. Now what we're going to do is paint in the opposite direction. So with these darker colors, where we were going up the model to sort of simulate road dust and stuff like that, what we're going to do now is we want to simulate just general collection of dust. And you want to be so careful with this. So as you see, I've got my dark sand. Don't forget you have a turret. Let's just get a closer look. You can do this with the turret separate, and to be honest, you know, I probably will do. But all you need to do is come down the model. So across the top of the hull, you want to add a little bit of this, but don't go crazy with it. Just enough that it looks like it's caught a bit more sun. And then on the turret is where you want to focus slightly more of this. So the bottom of your tank is going to look darker. Your turret and the top of your hull are going to look lighter. And through that, you're going to get this very cool sort of modulated color that you haven't had to use a single filter or airbrush or anything for. Easy as that. And then one of the last things to do, just a little bit of black on your machine guns. You might want to do this black before you do the weathering, but I tend to think because these are going to be more carefully maintained, it should be a nice flat black. Same too with the one on the turret. And our Panzer IV is complete, suitably messy, ready for the table, and I think pretty cool. Now you can spend the time doing things like the axes and small equipment on the sides. You know, you can paint those separately. I don't generally think that you need to. Reason being is that when these guys were out in the field spraying their tanks, very regularly they would just leave these small items of equipment on the vehicle and spray straight over them. Particularly the Americans, and the British did as well. So I'd say just go nuts. You know, save yourself the time and sanity. Same reason with not having to do all of the black or the sort of rubberized thing on the wheels here. A little bit of weathering will save you an awful lot of work in total. So hopefully, guys, something there was interesting to you. As always, feel free to drop any questions or anything in the old box below. Thank you very much for your time, and you guys enjoy the rest of your day.